Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much to Ken and to WITA for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel and part of this important and timely conversation. As Nelson says, the labor movement has been very engaged in the trade debate, certainly since NAFTA and even before. And, with respect to NAFTA, this is something that, we were engaged around the negotiation of NAFTA, trying to improve it, trying to change it. I remember what the slogan at that time was, "Not this NAFTA," because, as I've been saying, I've seen some of you at these panels before, the labor movement is not actually against globalization, we're not actually against trade, but we do have a strong critique of the exact set of rules that have been embedded in trade agreements like NAFTA, like the WTO, and like many of the other trade agreements since that time. But, with NAFTA, we engaged in the negotiations, we opposed the ultimate agreement. We used the agreement when it was in place. In particular, we used the labor chapter, the labor side agreement, very vigorously, dozens of times over the course of the last 20 or so years. And it was a very frustrating experience because I think everybody knows our critique of the NAFTA side agreement was that it wasn't in fact enforceable. The provisions were very weak. It was designed not to be used, and I think even the negotiators would tell you the NAFTA labor chapter was designed not to be used and never to come to actual dispute settlement. It's fulfilled that promise very well. But we've also criticized the NAFTA template, and I think that's what I'd like to really focus on today, because I think, we have one question in front of us, which is, how will NAFTA be renegotiated, if at all? Should it be renegotiated? How should it be renegotiated? But I think the bigger question is, what does the NAFTA debate mean for our trade policy, and what should be the principles that guide our trade policy going forward? And I think that is, I want to talk about NAFTA absolutely, but I also want to talk about what does it mean for all of us as we think about these important issues. And I do want to say that there has been, for the labor movement, but not just the labor movement, but a lot of our allies in the globalization debate, the environmental groups, and the consumer groups, and the women's groups, and the access to medicine folks, and some of the development and immigrant rights groups. These are the groups that we've been working with, not just in the United States, but internationally. Because we do, as a labor movement, we believe in international solidarity. We believe in trying to write a set of rules for the global economy that will be good for workers everywhere. And I think that's one important difference between the way we approach these issues and the way the current administration does, which is we don't say America first. We don't believe that countries are winners and losers in the trade debate. We want to talk about what kind of a global economy do we as working people want to live in? What kind of protections for workers, for the environment, for consumer, would be necessary to have trade policy benefit communities and workers, and to, certainly in the United States, create good jobs, including in the manufacturing sector. That's a different set of questions than just how can we get more free trade, or how can we get the trade barriers down, or what kind of protections for investors do we need in trade agreements. And so that goes to the heart of what I want to say. We said a long time ago that NAFTA was not only about trade. It was about investment and protectors for investors, whether it was the investor-state dispute settlement or the intellectual property rights or the financial services chapter. And then it was also about outsourcing as much as it was about exports. And at the end of the day, if you look at the trade flows, there wasn't really as much exporting of consumer goods to the 90 million consumers on our southern border as had been promised. NAFTA failed to live up to most of the promises that were made on its behalf during that debate around 23 years ago. Instead of exporting a lot of consumer goods, a lot of American companies took advantage of NAFTA to move jobs to Mexico and bring the goods back into the United States. And that's why our small trade surplus with Mexico turned into a pretty large trade deficit pretty quickly. We also said that the investor-state dispute settlement, embedding that into a trade agreement for the first time, was a bad idea, and that it would be used to challenge legitimate environmental and public health regulations in all three countries. And I think the record has shown that that has been the case, that NAFTA was used in a way that wasn't about trade so much, but was also about corporate interests and taking advantage. NAFTA was supposed to strengthen the competitiveness of the North American continent vis-a-vis Asia and Europe. Certainly for the United States, that didn't work out. Our trade deficit with the rest of the world went way up. It didn't go down. So in a lot of ways, it failed. But how could NAFTA be improved. And I do want to lay out that the AFL-CIO has laid out what we call our NAFTA blueprint. It's something we're working with members of Congress on, and we're working with a lot of allies on. We do think we should eliminate the investor-state dispute settlement. We want to strengthen, of course, and enforce the labor and environmental provisions in NAFTA. These are provisions that have evolved over the years, but have never really worked. We've brought a lot of cases, as I said, under the labor chapter, and yet there's never been a dispute settlement case. There's never been an enforcement mechanism that actually made a difference there. So that needs to be done. We need to address currency manipulation. This is the same argument we've made in the context of the TPP and other trade agreements, that having trade agreements that discipline tariffs and subsidies and other trade flows but don't address currency at all is a weakness. We want to upgrade the rules of origin. We have concerns around the procurement chapter and how it prevents the U.S. government from using its purchasing power to achieve its goals, and upgrade the trade enforcement chapter and address some of the concerns around trucking and make sure that safety is paramount. But TPP, let me just be clear here. The idea that TPP is the model for renegotiating NAFTA, I think, is delusional. I just think people have to remember that one of the things we learned, and I think we shouldn't have come through this election without learning something, which is that there was a groundswell of frustration and anger and opposition to our current trade model. And so the kinds of changes we need are deep. They're not shallow. They're not tweaking. We need to rethink the basic principles of our trading policy. And in some of those areas, President Trump has outlined some top notes that I think we would agree with, that we should be concerned around the trade deficit. We should be concerned about outsourcing. We should be concerned about how trade affects good jobs in the United States of America. But what I think is missing from the way President Trump has outlined his concerns is that we are part of a rules-based system. We need to continue to be part of a rules-based system. We need to work, and I think the labor movement has done this. I think we've demonstrated that we will work within the system to convince our government, to convince the Congress, to work with unions and environmental groups in other countries, to work with their governments, to change the rules that we disagree with, but not to toss them out and to work in an arbitrary way, but also to work in a way that reflects a respect for our trading partners and a sense of the importance of global solidarity. In terms of immigration, and all globalization is about trade in goods and services, but it is also about the movement of money and financial flows across borders, and about people. And so, I think one of the biggest concerns the labor movement has expressed around the Trump administration is the immigration policies, and whether those are demonstrating the kinds of principles that we want to see in terms of our interactions with the rest of the world, that we need to be humane, we need to be rational, and we need to make sure that those principles are constitutional. So at the end of the day, I'm trying to put a lot on the table so we'll have room for a good, lively discussion. I think, we believe in a rules-based system. We believe, ultimately, trade agreements and trade rules are about addressing the intersectionality of democratic decision-making with international movements of goods, services, and people and money. And we in the labor movement, and I think a lot of our allies have said that democratic decision-making is more important than that. And so maybe we haven't gotten the balance right of whether, we need to have trade agreements that can undermine our domestic regulatory systems, undermine labor rights and environmental standards and consumer protections. And so, particularly with respect to ISDS, but I think also with the way that we've addressed regulatory coherence in our trade agreements, we have not done a good job. We have not found the right balance. And I would say, I think a lot of people in the DC trade community are used to thinking of the critics of NAFTA or the critics of TPP as the enemy. But I would say to you, I think we actually have a lot in common in the sense that we want to figure out how we can fix the trading system and the rules of the trading system. We believe that it is important to take into consideration what the impact on jobs is going to be of our trade policy. And it shouldn't be only Donald Trump who says it. It should be leaders of both the Democratic and the Republican Party, whether they're presidential candidates or whether they are in Congress. And to the extent that we can build together a progressive internationalist framework for international trade, I think we will be in a stronger position than if we stick our heads in the sand and pretend that NAFTA has been a tremendous success and that all we need to do is to pick it right back up and move it forward as it is. We need to recognize the issues and the problems that have been clear over the last couple of decades.
Thank you, Thea. You know, shortly after the president's inaugural, he called the labor leaders to the White House, and they emerged wreathed in smiles, which is not typical of encounters between labor leaders and Republican presidents. Do you feel that you have a good dialogue with the administration on the trade issues, and on are you able to offer your input to a process?
We do have a dialogue, and we will continue to use whatever avenues we have. We have formal avenues like we've had with every previous administration through the Labor Advisory Committees for trade policy negotiations. That hasn't met yet. But you know, our job is to advocate for American workers. We will do that with this administration. Certainly there's been some outreach, there have been some conversations, you know, and as I said, I think we might agree on the top note that our current trade system is broken, but we don't necessarily agree on what the narrative is or how to fix it. And those are areas we want to continue to engage, we want to continue to offer our views. I mean, one thing I would say, for example, in terms of what's wrong with the U.S., why is the U.S. run a big trade deficit? Why are we not as competitive as we'd like to be? To the extent that the Trump administration has said the problem is that we're overregulated, that taxes are too high, and that workers' wages are too high, we would have a fundamental disagreement with that. We don't think that that is the source of the problem.
Thank you. I'm going